Hello. Today I'm going to share a story that will reignite your belief in the power of human kindness and show how one person's compassion can create a lasting, meaningful impact. Enjoy the journey.
Emily Davis, at just 20 years old, stood in the dingy bathroom of the rundown gas station where she worked. The mirror was streaked with grime, making it hard for her to see her reflection clearly, but even through the smudged glass, she could see the weariness in her own brown eyes. Life had not been kind to her, and those years of hardship seemed to have left a permanent mark on her. She adjusted the faded blue uniform she wore, pulling at the fabric with fingers that were calloused from a lifetime of struggle. It was a far cry from the kind of life she had once dreamed of when she was younger, back when hope still flickered faintly in her heart. Now, that hope had been dimmed, nearly snuffed out by the relentless challenges she had faced since childhood. As she turned away from the mirror, her thoughts drifted back to St. Mary's Orphanage, the place that had been her home for most of her childhood. The gray stone walls of the orphanage had always felt cold, and the atmosphere inside had been even colder. The nuns who ran the place were strict, and the other children were more interested in survival than in forming any kind of lasting friendship. Emily had learned early on that it was every child for themselves in that place. But even before she arrived at St. Mary's, Emily's life had been marked by hardship. She had vague memories of living with her mother, though those memories were often clouded by the loud arguments and slammed doors that seemed to dominate their small apartment. Her mother had been a troubled woman, struggling with her own demons, and it was only a matter of time before those struggles became too much for her to handle. The night of her mother's fatal overdose had marked the beginning of a new, even more difficult chapter in Emily's life. At the age of 6, Emily found herself in the care of her stepfather, Rick, a man who had little interest in raising a child and even less patience for Emily's quiet presence. For 2 long years, she endured his neglect and the occasional burst of anger that came with his drinking. Rick wasn't violent, not physically at least, but his words cut deep, leaving scars that Emily would carry with her for the rest of her life. Food was often scarce in their small apartment. Dinner, when there was any, might consist of stale cereal or a sandwich made with whatever happened to be left in the fridge. Most nights Emily went to bed with the ache of hunger gnawing at her stomach, but she had learned not to complain. Complaining only made Rick angrier, and she had long since learned that it was better to remain invisible. When the neighbors finally called social services, Emily was taken away from Rick and placed in St. Mary's Orphanage. She was 8 years old, and though the orphanage wasn't much better than the life she had left behind, at least it was consistent. There was always food, even if it wasn't much, and she had a bed to sleep in, even if it was lumpy and uncomfortable. For a while, that was enough. At St. Mary's, there was one bright spot: Mrs. Robertson, the orphanage's kind-hearted administrator. Unlike the other adults at the orphanage, who seemed to view the children as little more than responsibilities to be managed, Mrs. Robertson had a soft spot for Emily. Each year on her birthday, Mrs. Robertson would sneak her a small gift, something simple like a brightly colored ribbon for her hair, or a new bookmark for her well-worn books. These small tokens of kindness meant the world to Emily, who had learned early on not to expect much from anyone. As the years passed, Emily became accustomed to the routine at St. Mary's. But on her 18th birthday, the routine came to an abrupt end. Like so many others before her, she had aged out of the system, and with no family to turn to, she was left to fend for herself. Armed with a small monthly stipend and a handful of second-hand belongings, Emily found herself standing at the doorstep of a dingy apartment building on the outskirts of town, unsure of what her next step would be. The apartment was far from ideal. The walls were thin, the plumbing unreliable, and the neighborhood was known for its crime and poverty. But it was all she had, and she was determined to make the best of it. With no high school diploma and no real work experience, finding a job was difficult. Emily took whatever odd jobs she could find: walking dogs, babysitting, cleaning houses, but the pay was never enough to cover her basic needs. Then, one fateful day, while walking through town, Emily noticed a help wanted sign in the window of a small 24-hour gas station. Desperate for steady work, she stepped inside and inquired about the job. The owner, Dan Wilson, was a middle-aged man with a rough exterior. He eyed her up and down as she filled out the application, making Emily feel uncomfortable, but she couldn't afford to walk away. She needed the job, no matter how unsettling Dan's behavior was. "All right, sweetheart, you're hired," Dan said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You can start tonight, overnight shift. Sandra and Olivia will show you how things work around here." Emily's stomach churned as she thanked him, but she forced a smile. She had dealt with worse in her life, and she wasn't going to let one man's creepy demeanor scare her away from an opportunity to finally earn a steady paycheck. That night, Emily arrived for her first shift. Sandra, a hardened blonde woman in her mid-30s, and Olivia, a gum-smacking girl with too much makeup and an air of boredom, greeted her with little enthusiasm. "Here's the deal, newbie," Sandra said, her tone sharp. "We skim a little off the top from each customer. A few bucks here, a few bucks there. Dan gets his cut and we get ours. Got it?" Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's stealing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't do that." Olivia rolled her eyes, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Suit yourself, Miss Goody Two-Shoes, but don't expect Dan to give you any bonuses for being honest." Emily felt a surge of fear and uncertainty, but she stood her ground. She had faced far worse than this in her life, and she wasn't about to compromise her values now. As the weeks passed, Emily did her best to avoid Sandra and Olivia's underhanded tactics, but it wasn't easy. Dan's lingering stares made her skin crawl, and every shift felt like a battle just to keep her job without falling into the same dishonest practices as her coworkers. One evening, Dan called a staff meeting. His usual gruff demeanor was replaced by a more serious tone as he addressed the small group. "Profits are down," he announced, pacing back and forth. "If things don't turn around soon, I might have to sell this place." Sandra and Olivia exchanged knowing looks, but Emily stayed silent. She knew why profits were down, but she didn't dare speak up. After all, she was still the newest employee, and she had no desire to get on Dan's bad side. But as the meeting dragged on, Emily's guilt gnawed at her. Finally, she hesitated before speaking. "Maybe," she began softly, "maybe it's because not everyone is being honest with the transactions." Dan's eyes narrowed as he turned his gaze on her. "What are you saying, Emily? Are you accusing someone of stealing?" Emily's heart raced as she faltered under his intense stare. "No, I just thought—" "That's what I thought," Dan snapped. "Unless someone has a better idea, I'm going to start looking for buyers." Emily's stomach dropped. The thought of losing this job, as much as she hated it, filled her with dread. It was the only thing keeping her afloat, and without it, she wasn't sure how she would survive.